In America, Veterans Day, observed every November 11th, is such an important day, or should be, for all Americans. It's a day to honor and appreciate all servicemen, past, present, and future, who fight for all of us to be free. This same commemoration is observed annually on April the 25th for Australians and New Zealanders. This special day, known as Anzac Day, an acronym for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and was devised during World War I. With this date around the corner, I really wanted to pause and give thanks to all patriotic men and women around the world who fight for basic human rights and freedoms. Welcome to Summer Bakes the World. This channel focuses on baking authentic breads and dishes from all over the world with significant culture, history, and baking tips peppered throughout. In honor of our Aussie service veterans, today's bake focuses on the native Australians, the Aborigines. The Aborigines to Australia are like my Choctaw and Cherokee ancestors, the original inhabitants of North America. They were hunters and gatherers. They lived off the land utilizing only what they needed. They taught European settlers many food gathering skills. Unfortunately, though, these settlers in Australia treated Aborigines the way American settlers treated my ancestors, forcing them to assimilate. However, on a positive note, the Aborigines are the ones who introduced the bread we're baking today to the European settlers. In Aboriginal culture, this bread is simple and known as bush bread. But the Europeans renamed it as damper bread because of the way the Aborigines baked it over hot coals. In its most basic form, bush bread is just flour and water. But salt and baking powder are typically added for flavoring and rising. In old Aboriginal culture, women and children used grinding stones to grind local seeds into flour. It was a hard physical task that would take about 2 hours to produce about 1 pound of flour. Whoa! Think of it this way. The 5-pound bag of flour you buy in the grocery stores would have taken them 10 solid hours to process by hand. And they would go through more than 5 pounds of flour for a tribe pretty quickly. Crikey! Thank you to machines. Once the flour was mixed with water, the Aborigines would bake the bread loaves directly in the ashes or on the hot coals of a campfire. That's where the damper name comes from, to damper, dull, or depress the fire, which is what they did in order to bake in ash. And yes, as you would have guessed, there were ashes on that baked bread. But they would simply brush or tear off that black ash and eat the clean portions around and on the inside. Thanks to modern convenience, today we are using store-bought flour and baking our bread in a Dutch oven in an oven. But you could bake this bread in a cast iron Dutch oven over hot coals of a campfire. Here are the ingredients of our bush or damper bread. All-purpose flour, salt, baking powder, and milk. You could sub water for the milk. Such a simple ingredient list, but oh, so filling. This bread is a blank slate for eating with any meal and with any topping. In fact, after we bake this bread today, we're going to turn slices of this bread into the famous Australian nostalgic childhood favorite, fairy bread. You gotta watch the end of this video for that. Your kids will love you for it. This bread is super simple and quick to make and bake, even if you're not a fan of baking. So first, in a large bowl like I have here, we're gonna add 4 cups of flour. I've just put in 3 cups, so I'm gonna add in my 4th cup now, making sure that I fluff my flour in the container before I scoop it so I don't get too much flour in my cup here. So that's my 4 cups of flour. And then to that, we're gonna add 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Not baking soda, but baking powder. They're two very different things because baking powder actually has an acid component to it where baking soda does not. Okay, so now we're just gonna quickly whisk the flour and the baking powder together. Now, unlike the Irish soda bread that I made recently that used baking soda, this one is using baking powder. So the difference is the acid is already in the baking powder, so we don't have to add a buttermilk component where the acid is there to react with the soda. So in this case, we don't have to add any acid to it because the acid already exists in the powder. Baking powder alone mixed with any liquid, whether it's milk or water, will be enough for the dough to rise a bit without any yeast. This is mixed enough. We're gonna add our wet ingredient, which is the milk. We're gonna measure out 1 cup of milk. You could use water in place of milk here. I'm using whole milk because I want a nice flavor to this bread. And I want it to be just a tad bit indulgent. So when you're pouring liquids, just make sure you pour on a flat surface so that you get the exact amount of liquid that you need. And then baking bread, if you have too much liquid, too much flour, add more of the other. So we're gonna heat this up in the microwave because I want the temperature of my liquid to be between 100 and 110 degrees, which I have found to be the optimal temperature for activating yeast. And even though we don't have yeast in this recipe, dough cooks more efficiently and evenly in the oven when all of your ingredients are roughly about the same temperature. So we don't want anything too cold or too hot in our mixture. And as an aside, did you know that if your room temperature is cool, you should heat up your liquid ingredients a few degrees warmer because of the air temperature, and it will cool it down much quicker. In the microwave, this goes till we get to that 100 to 110 degree mark. All right, so my milk only took about 50 seconds in the microwave for it to reach that 110 degree mark. So I would check it about every 30 seconds and stir it and make sure that it's not too hot. But now I made a little well in my flour and baking powder mixture here. So I'm just gonna slowly pour in my milk. So I'm just wanna stir it in well to make sure it gets combined. So I've got lots of bits of flour still left and I clearly need some more liquid in this. And I do live in a dry climate, so I tend to have to add a little bit more water, more liquid sometimes to my flour mixture. Before I add it, I'm gonna get in here with my hands and just make sure that it's not too wet. I think sometimes the best tools are your hands when it comes to dough because you want to be able to feel the texture of the dough, and that way you can easily determine if you need more liquid or more flour. So I've been kneading this with my hands in the bowl and it's not very sticky. In fact, it's pretty dry and I still have bits of flour that even though it has some milk in it, it's not holding together. So I obviously need to add more liquid. So I'm gonna put a little bit more milk in here and I'm gonna heat it up in the microwave again just to make sure it's about the same temperature as what I already put in here, and then continue mixing. So I'll put about 1/8 of a cup of my milk in the microwave for 15 seconds and it's warm enough. I'm just gonna pour all of it in here. And again, if I end up adding too much liquid, I'll just add a little bit more flour. So it's okay. So I'm gonna get back in here and see if I can get those bits of flour at the bottom mixed in and soaked in. We'll move to the hands too. I think I could probably use another tablespoon of liquid. So I'm actually gonna move to water this time. And I'm just using tap water, but I had it on really warm so that I could make sure and get that right temperature. So this is just warm tap water. The last ingredient this recipe calls for is salt. And it does call for salt after you add the liquid, which, you know, another bread I made recently did the same thing and I find it a little odd and I'm not so sure what I think about it. Scott has not been able to tell the difference in any concentrations of salt in the breads when I've put them in at the end, but I just find it strange because I feel like it may not get mixed in as much as it would be if I could put it in during the baking powder and the flour mixture. I don't know, to each his own. I honestly don't think it matters much. If you want to put the salt at the same time you mix the flour and the baking powder, do that. So now we're just gonna knead this a little bit. So since this is a quick bread, let's go ahead and preheat our oven, and we're going to preheat the oven to 410 degrees. And while that's preheating, we're gonna finish kneading this a little bit more and then shaping it for our Dutch oven. So you're gonna need a floured surface on which to knead. So I'm gonna use a tea towel, my favorite, along with my kneading board, actually a cutting board. So let's put down a little bit of flour. Now this is not a bread we're gonna need a lot because we don't need to develop any gluten. So we just really wanna make sure that the salt has been mixed in well, and we also want to just make sure that we can form it into the shape that we need it for our Dutch oven. We don't wanna knead it too much because we don't wanna make this a tough, too dense of a bread because it should be a little bit light since we put in that baking powder. So go ahead and fold it over a couple times just so we can get a nice, maybe a smooth looking round ball. This is a heavy dough. It's a pretty dense dough. Since there's no rising time required, it's not gonna be a very light dough. So my oven timer just went off, meaning that it is preheated. So I have actually decided to go with a cast iron skillet for this bake today instead of my Dutch oven over there because it's 6 quart and it's really big compared to the small loaf of bread that we have, this dough. So I'm just gonna put it in this one today, and it'll be fine because cast iron is what you would have used if you were in the outback in Australia. So we're gonna go with that today. But you can use a Dutch oven, totally fine. So we're gonna put this in the oven. So since it's heated, I've got a rack in the middle. So I'm just gonna place my skillet in there, set the timer for 5 minutes, and let it heat up for 5 minutes. My skillet has heated up for 5 minutes, so it's ready to go. Now the last thing we need to do is sprinkle some flour in the bottom of the skillet or Dutch oven, whichever you're using. The flour here is going to prevent our damper bread from sticking to the skillet. And of course, make sure you use a pot holder when you are picking up your skillet because you certainly don't want to burn yourself. Now, being careful not to touch the skillet, we're going to take the damper dough here and we're just going to place it in the skillet or Dutch oven. Careful not to touch it. And then just carefully, you're going to pat it out to where it's about to the edge of your skillet, which is why I didn't want to use my Dutch oven because it's too big for this small damper dough. So we're gonna put this damper bread in the oven for 45 minutes until the top is lightly browned. The bread will swell some because it has that baking powder in it. The recipe directions say to open it periodically and just shake it to make sure that the bread is moving around and it's not sticking to the pan. So I might do that about 15 to 20 minutes in. So the damper bread is baked when a knife or toothpick inserted in the center when it comes out clean or the internal temperature reaches 190 degrees. So in the oven, 45 minutes. Our damper bread is baked. Take a look. The internal temperature is at just under 200 degrees, so it's just perfect for it to be done. So as you can tell, it's a very simple rustic bread. It did rise just because of the baking powder. That's why we like the baking powder in here. And we're just gonna let it cool for about 10-20 minutes, and then we'll cut into it, take a look, and give it a taste. Okay, our beautiful bread is cooling. And take a look at this. It did rise from the baking powder because it was a flat loaf when I put it in the oven, and now it's rounded on top. It is a rustic bread. You could make artisan cuts into the top if you wanted to just do like a crisscross, and that would be fine too, like we did with the Irish soda bread, but you don't have to. This is meant to be campfire cooked and rustic. So guess what? No sticking because we put flour at the bottom of the pan. And so when this was in the oven and I shook it, it did that very thing. There was no sticking at all. So I think the flour is super important and critical to this. All right, such a simple loaf of bread. But like I said, you don't even have to bake and you can make a nice loaf of bread like this. It is dense, so it's not gonna be soft like the other breads we've been making recently, the yeasted breads, because there's no gluten development that's been going on. But you can see as I tear it apart, it feels like a biscuit, the American biscuit. So that's what you're gonna have here. And it even smells like an American biscuit. All right, but it's a nice hearty loaf of bread. If you're wanting a quick loaf of bread, this would be a good one to make. Let's give it a taste. Due to my gluten intolerance, Scott is joining us today. Oi, mate.
What?
It's Australian, it's okay. Today's bake is the Australian bush bread, also known as the damper bread. It resembles the Irish soda bread in simplicity, but doesn't contain any baking soda. So, like the Irish soda bread, we only have 4 simple ingredients. We will give it a taste and I'll tell you what's in it, those 4 simple ingredients. So this bread is so simple that it was made and baked originally by the Aborigines in the backcountry over hot coals or ashes. You're tasting flour, baking powder, salt, and whole milk. So if there's any richness in this bread, it's going to be from the milk. The difference between this bread and Irish soda bread is the substitution of baking powder for soda and either water or milk in place of the buttermilk. And since there's already acid in the baking powder, we don't need it in the dairy. What are your thoughts?
Hard crust, but soft in the middle.
Okay.
I can taste it's a little bit more rich than some breads, so I guess that's the milk.
Yes, so you could make this bread with water, but that's a good point to make. If you're wanting an indulgent bread at home, but a very simple bread, use milk in place of water. If you don't really care because you're using it as a vehicle for your meal and to sop up juices, then water I think would be totally fine.
Pretty simple.
Yeah. Do you like it? I mean, is it flavor? You're pretty okay with it?
Yeah, it's good. It's just simple.
Yes. Biscuit? Does it remind you of a biscuit?
A little bit. It's a little bit different than a traditional Southern biscuit, though.
Yeah, it's probably a little denser because we don't, and probably not quite as rich because we don't have any shortening or butter in it, which is what's traditional in a Southern biscuit.
Okay.
But I think it's good all around bread, you think, since it is very simple?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, butter, jam? you could put on.
Yeah, I could see it. I could see it as like a breakfast bread or as an accompaniment for dinner.
Okay. So this is such a simple bread. You can even make this on your next camping or backpacking trip. Which, by the way, stay tuned to my backpacking bread bake video coming soon. You just might be shocked at what little you need to bake in the outdoors. If you'd rather have a more indulgent bread, see the recipe link below this video for many suggestions that I have for you. Unlike all of my other breads today, Scott, I have a special treat for you.
Oh?
Oh. So most every adult having grown up in Australia and every child currently living in Australia love this next step I'm going to show you. It is the famous fairy bread, like magical fairy. It's so fairy-ish that it tastes like it's magic. Okay. So it makes an appearance at every kid's birthday party in Australia. And adults are nostalgic for it as well. So all you need, and guess what? We're gonna make it right here and you're gonna help me.
Oh, okay.
So you need a slice of bread, which we're gonna use our handy dandy bread from here. So if you'll hold the bread for me, please. All right, you need some softened butter. And I did put mine in the microwave for a few seconds. So we wanna make sure we coat it well, but it's like our glue for the topping. Do you think that's enough butter for you?
Yep.
Okay. And then we're actually gonna put Scott's favorite topping. This is his favorite topping for ice cream and sugar cookies, and it's rainbow sprinkles. So pretty much anything that you would put on a sugar cookie, you could do the nonpareils, you could do chocolate chips, whatever you want, but you coat it well and make it look pretty. Am I putting enough sprinkles on there for you?
Yeah.
All right, so show the guys at home. This is the famous Australian fairy bread. So, Scott, take a bite. It is very crunchy. I can hear outside of the crust from the bread, I can hear the sprinkles being chomped on, very crunchy.
I don't know why it's so popular, but it's good.
Like the internet is crazy over fairy bread, and I think it's just because Americans hear about it, but they don't know what it is. So people are online searching for what is fairy bread? How do you make fairy bread? It's just butter and sprinkles on any white bread. That's all it is. But this is like a favorite childhood, nostalgic, bread in Australia. So should they eat it in New Zealand as well. The interesting thing is about this bread is that fairy bread has actually been around a very long time. This is not like a new trend. It was referenced in a 1913 poem by a Scottish writer named Robert Louis Stevenson. 1913, this has been around. While us Americans may think this is a new snack craze, it really isn't. Scott, imagine being a 10-year-old Scott. Would he like this?
My taste buds are a little different now than they were when I was 10. I probably would have wanted it sweeter when I was 10.
Yeah. So you could do a sweet version. You should add some ingredients to this bread and make it sweet. Put some, cinnamon and sugar in it. Maybe put that on top. And the Netherlands actually eat this bread, but they toast it. So there you go. The famous Australian fairy bread with the famous Aboriginal damper bush bread. In thinking about damper bread though, since it could be baked on the fly with so few ingredients, it provides sustenance and makes a great meal component for soldiers in war, a cowboy on the range, or a backpacker in the backcountry. If you have flour and water, you can bake bread like the Aborigines. Thanks to all veterans around the world for your bravery and patriotism in serving and protecting us all. This bread is for you. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and share my videos with your family and friends. I appreciate your support. Until next time, enjoy the simple, natural things in life like the Aborigines and Native Americans. Remember to thank veterans for their service, and as always, go bake the world.